You need a thesis statement.
Let's continue our discussion of articles by talking about the. The is a visual word. I'm pointing at it. There is a marker, but now let's look out our window. What do we see outside? Well, we see a building. We see a man on the sidewalk talking into his cell phone. Now, two things are going on here logically. One is that there's only one. Now, that's what A means, right? There's only one. But I'm being more specific than that and using the. I mean that one. That one is unlike any other. Why is it unlike any other? Because you can see it. That makes everything different. So we have two conditions for using the. One is that it is unique and individual, unlike any other. And second, you can see it. Okay, well, what's the problem with that? The problem is that often we use the for things we can't see. The European institutions of democratic reform, well, those are abstractions and we can't see them. The love between a man and a woman, the peace that passes all understanding, these are abstractions. We still use the for them because they exist as single entities. Now, often English will have a sentence pattern like this. Last night I went to a Chinese restaurant. The restaurant was very crowded. Well, see what's happening here. Last night we went to a Chinese restaurant. The restaurant was very crowded. Think of someone pointing at that image floating in your head. There is a unique individual image of that restaurant, and you can see it. So those two conditions might help you understand the. Another way of helping you practically in the matter of a and the is to remember that it is unusual to have a noun by itself in a sentence unless it's acting as a compound noun or has some other grammatical function. When spring is here, the flowers come out. We might say something like that. But common nouns generally don't appear by themselves. I had my students write about school uniforms. Many schools have school uniform. No, many schools have school uniforms. So one way of helping you remember to use articles is to remember that nouns usually have something. They either have an S, or they have an A, or they have the. Many schools require school uniforms. My daughter has a uniform. The uniform was very expensive. It might help you to think of this as a spectrum, moving from general abstract categories. Many schools have uniforms, to more specific. My daughter has a uniform. There's 100 uniforms in the store where she bought it. It's just one out of a group. To very specifically, the particular school uniform I'm speaking of was expensive. We're going from very broad and general to very specific. The second category I want to talk about, moving away from articles, is number agreement, which is related. I wear a suit. I am wearing a suit. Those people wear suits. That S is necessary. And often, again, one of the most common mistakes I see in writing is that there's no S. When we speak about, especially when we're speaking about generic categories, those people wear suits. Most dogs have tails. We need the plural marker. And often when you get the plural markers wrong, we have number disagreement. Now, it can get tricky sometimes because we have a sentence like, I like grapes. All right, well, grapes is plural. It's a group, many grapes. What about there is a box of grapes on the table? Why are we saying is when there's plural grapes? Because the box is individual. So don't be confused about containers or about confusing the subject with other parts of the sentence. This can get you into trouble. Something else, there's weird exceptions with number agreement. Okay, I'll use a fun example. My favorite activity is going to nightclubs, drinking beer and chasing girls. My favorite activities are going to nightclubs, drinking beer and chasing girls. Should it be is or are? And the answer is both. They could be is, because the speaker is thinking of these three activities as part of one activity. I simultaneously am at the nightclub and drinking the beer and chasing the girls, or I am doing those three things on separate occasions. Sometimes I'm chasing girls and I'm in the library. Sometimes I'm drinking beer in my dorm room. Those three activities may not be necessarily connected. So there are situations in English where there is where number agreement may differ, but in general, do the best you can. Remember that usually nouns either have an S or an A or a the in 95% of the situation, in 95% of cases. Like other grammatical issues, number disagreement becomes particularly serious when you write more complicated sentences. Here the reader will have trouble understanding the sentence. But here the sentence is probably not going to be understood at all. In English, number agreement is neither trivial nor optional. Another particular problem that new speakers of English have is countable and uncountable nouns. Unfortunately, new speakers often just have to memorize these words. The only pattern is that nouns for liquids, such as coffee, rain, snow, and beer, are usually uncountable, because logically they are difficult to divide into parts. Okay, let's move on to prepositions. Prepositions are also very important in English because they make the connection between parts of the sentence clear. Now, sometimes you can leave these out in Korean. You can leave out prepositions. 집에 가요, I am going home, I am going to home with the E ending. You could probably omit this in Korean and people would understand. In English, that's not the best example. I go home. We say that this way of speaking is grandfathered. Because people have been saying I'm going home for 1,000 years, no preposition is required. But I'm going shopping center. I'm going license registry office. I'm going restaurant. They don't make sense because the speaker or the listener does not understand the connection between I'm going and restaurant or the noun. That needs to be made explicit. I'm going to the restaurant. I'm going to a restaurant. I'm going to a or the shopping center. We need the preposition. The cat is table. What the heck does that mean? The cat is a table? The cat is made of marble? No, we need to make clear the relationship between the cat and the table. The cat is on the table. The cat is under the table. The cat is beside the table. We need to specify the relationship between the cat and the table. And that's a very simple sentence. If I'm making a more complex or a longer sentence and it's not understandable how these parts of the sentence relate to each other, the whole sentence falls down. So that's something, unfortunately, that requires attention and experience because English has a maddeningly complex preposition system. We say, I'm riding on a bus, but I'm in a car because of historical reasons related to how these vehicles were made or how they functioned. But a better example, I will meet you at 2 o'clock on Tuesday in June in 2011. So we have different prepositions for these different nouns. and unfortunately they simply must be memorized.
To summarize, whereas Korean uses particle endings to indicate prepositional function, English uses separate words. Unlike Korean, with a few exceptions, they can never be omitted. We can divide English prepositions roughly into categories of time, place, and direction. That's easy enough. Where it gets difficult is the many expressions, such as I am on top of it, or I am into jogging, or she was at him to cut his hair. These again need to be memorized. A related problem is active and passive voice. Passive voice is rarely used in Korean, but it's often used in English where who did something is unknown or secondary in importance. English tells us who did what by word order. The dog bit the man. If we write this in passive, we reverse the words. The man is bitten by the dog. But without extra words, we don't know who bit who. We need a preposition and a verb tense change to make the connection clear. Sometimes we use different types of words to make the passive, but now we're moving away from prepositions to the wider issue of word class in English.
The last category I'm going to talk about is word class. Sometimes I have students write, I am boring, I was very boring this weekend, and I have a kind of guilty laugh, he, you're boring every day. But that's not what the student meant. They meant I was bored this weekend. They confused a verb acting as an adjective with the past participle. But people make mistakes such as this all the time. They confuse the word class. They confuse verbs with nouns, with adjectives, with adverbs. This can easily happen because English is a language that lets you change word class very easily. But if you use the wrong word class, you can really confuse the reader because they don't understand how the sentence is working.
Let's look at some more common errors that new learners of English make, in particular those learners who speak Korean natively. Quite often English sentences have the wrong meaning or no meaning because of missing words. If you write I cook you, it has a different meaning from I cook with you. The first makes you sound like a cannibal. Some phrases in English require prepositions and others don't. I hear you, I see you, I kiss you. But I dance with you, I listen to you. Again, they need to be memorized. Or students confuse words such as almost and all, which are sometimes adverbs and sometimes determiners. Almost people like coffee. But it can also be possible to overcorrect. Most of students don't want early classes. Here we can fix this by adding an article. Most of the students don't want early classes. But it might be easiest to use most only with nouns. Most students. Some of these errors again reflect the problem of language interference. Korean has a smaller number of modal auxiliaries than English does, and so sometimes we get sentences like this. When the sun sets, it should get dark. In English, there is a clearer distinction between modals of choice, should, ought to, and those of necessity, must, have to. A second example of language interference comes from the lack of the phrase there is in Korean. Instead, Korean has isoil and ends a statement with it. Literally, something exists or is. But writing a cat exists on the street sounds pretty strange in English because of the slight difference in meaning between there is and exists. Another situation where you can't trust a computer translator. Again, Korean allows you to make these distinctions clear through context. English doesn't so much. The sentence needs to be totally clear on its own.
Do your best, is all I can say. Nobody expects you to do this perfectly, but as I've said in other segments, it's a matter of credibility. You want to write correct grammar, not simply because if the sentence is faulty, no one understands what you're saying, but you want people to have confidence in what you're trying to tell them. Trust is an important part of the language and an important part of text. There is a sort of intimacy between the writer and the reader. So do your best.